So our first speaker is Danielle Brian, Executive Director of the Project on Government Oversight, which is an incredibly valuable organization in Washington. It's got more than 40 staffers who basically are there to monitor and watch oversight functions of government spending and do a lot of oversight themselves. They've done a lot of work on getting a handle on the COVID oversight mechanisms. And Danielle is going to talk about that, as well as some COVID Watch platforms that they're going to be unveiling in a couple of weeks. It is now 11, a little after 11. We have her until 11:50, and she is going to talk, and she's got a tip sheet we'll be able to hand on to you also, and we'll have plenty of time for questions. So I'll turn it over to Danielle.
Thank you so much, Chris. I'm sorry we're not meeting in person, all of us. I know that makes it for a much easier conversation. I don't like just talking, and I'm not great at seeing if you do that sort of hand up thing. So I really want you to interrupt me. I know that feels awkward, but if you can, I'll try. If you put the hand up, I'll be trying, but I have to scroll to see the names, or you could put something in the chat. But I much prefer these being conversations than just lectures. So I'm first going to start by talking about human sources that I want to just flag for you as possibly useful. The first, I know some of you are coming from local and regional outlets, and the thing that I think sometimes is overlooked is the value of the people in your community to be fabulous sources for COVID relief spending coverage. So by even just starting to report in this space, you're going to start attracting people, especially if you're able to signal, please contact me with your story. That's one way that you're going to be getting people who are going to be incredibly valuable for storytelling. Either they're going to be first responders, or they're going to be employees, for example, from an entity that received a PPP loan, which presumably was to keep their people on the payroll. And one of the big questions now is that how the money is being spent? So I just wanted to flag, especially in those local and regional outlets, that's a really valuable opportunity for you. But because I'm a Washington person, I know that I need to be focusing on our Washington sources for you. And so the one thing that's very complicated about what's happened with COVID relief spending is there are all these different overlapping oversight bodies. And so I'm going to try to sort of break down who they are and what their different missions are. So I'm going to now start trying to share my screen. First, let me do this properly. So the first one that isn't on any of the resources, because it's the most recently created site, is the Special Select Committee that was created by Speaker Pelosi. So you'll see this is a coronavirus.house.gov. I've specifically gone to their members page because, again, for those of you who are coming to this from a local or regional outlet, see if you have a representative in Washington from your district, because they're going to care more about your outlet than national outlets to get coverage. So these were people, many of whom you'll see were actually chair people themselves of subcommittees typically, or even full committees like both Carolyn Maloney and Maxine Waters. The chair is Mr. Clyburn from South Carolina. So if you are representing, or if you are reporting on areas where these people represent, they're really going to want to break their stories in your outlets. This is a committee that has, honestly, I did not know why Speaker Pelosi created it. It was not part of the legislation. And as I mentioned, just about everyone on the committee is either a chair of a subcommittee or ranking. And so they could have been doing this work in their standing committees. So that's something also to remember is, for example, Maxine Waters, in addition to being on this committee, she's also the chair of the Financial Services Committee. And they're doing a lot of really important analysis into the banks. Something that I think is really important for everyone to be looking at is, how did this all unfold, where the SBA was, essentially in the early days of the PPP loans, for example, the banks were clearly favoring their bigger customers, which was not the intent of the Congress, but the legislation didn't prevent it. And that's why we saw some of these obviously super wealthy clients of the banks getting loans, when we all in our communities are seeing small businesses that applied in the early days and were denied and now are closing shop. So she's also doing work on her standing committee of House Financial Affairs. Carolyn Maloney is also the chair of the Oversight Committee. So in addition to this committee, which was stood up specifically for coronavirus oversight, which is not just on the spending, but also on the response to the pandemic in terms of health implications as well. So it's both economic and health really is what they're looking at. But they have also other work that's going on. So I'd really encourage you to if you have any relationships or if they represent in your areas, develop relationships with the press person from these offices, because they are going to be great sources of information. So then,
Danielle,
yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
You know, of those names that are on there, both for the Dems and the Republicans, are there members who, you know, are good, you know, serious, you know, fraud watchers, people who are there members there who are like the best ones, who will be kind of most knowledgeable about what's actually going on?
Great question. That's a great question. I would say also it's who has great staff as well as the member really caring about it. So Maxine Waters has great staff. Carolyn Maloney has great staff. Jamie Raskin also has great staff. He's a Maryland congressman. Interestingly, his wife, Sarah Bloom Raskin, sat on the Federal Reserve Board of Governors and was a official in the Treasury Department. So there's sort of a power couple if you can reach both of them to talk about these issues, because she has very interesting insights as well. So those are the ones that I would be sort of going to if you don't have a specific district relationship with the other members, especially because Maloney and Maxine Waters, being the chair of these full committees as well, have really solid staff that have been looking at this stuff for a long time.
And who among the Republicans is most likely to take it seriously?
See, that's what the problem is. This is a super partisan committee. So Steve Scalise is the chair, the ranking for them, and Jim Jordan. And what you see when they're having their hearings is they do not have any common ground. So you'll watch a hearing where it's almost like they're in these bizarro two different worlds, where the Democrats are talking about actually literally about, you know, whether hospitals are getting enough access to the PPEs and things that they need. And the Republicans are talking about how China is responsible for the pandemic. So it depends what you need in your story, I guess. But they definitely have different narratives that they're focused on. So I'm not seeing this as the kind of committee that I look for, which frankly is very hard to find these days, where they're actually coming with like serious investigations into particular issues and they can come up with sort of common ground findings. You're not going to see that in this committee.
Okay, thanks.
But the Congress did create 3 oversight mechanisms in the CARES Act. The first one is the Congressional Oversight Commission, and that is supposed to be 5 people who are particularly looking at the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department. So that's some of the stuff that's getting much less attention and probably needs a lot more attention than it's getting, are these, frankly, extremely complex facilities, which is the term of art that the Federal Reserve uses to allow industries to access huge additional funds at very low interest rates. The problem, there's multiple problems. One is there is no website for this commission, in part because the law required that Pelosi and McConnell had to agree on a chair, and they have not. So there is no chair. So what I'm going to show you are and the Congress requires that this commission give monthly reports. These are super high quality, as it turns out, but you wouldn't know where to find them unless you were really aggressively looking for them. This is one of the 4 sitting members is Congresswoman Donna Shalala. I picked her because I know there's at least one person or 2 people from Florida, and she's a congresswoman from Florida. She's one of the 4 people who have been appointed. So it's 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans. So the way you find these monthly reports is going to a couple of those people who are sitting on the commission's websites for their personal office. So the 4 people who are on the commission are here. French Hill is a Republican member of Congress. Bharat Ramamurthy was a Elizabeth Warren staffer. Donna Shalala is a congresswoman, Democratic congresswoman from Miami, and Pat Toomey. And so what you'll see is here's an example of, and oh, Pat Toomey is a Republican from Pennsylvania, sorry, and Congressman French Hill is a Republican from Arkansas. So you'll have to go to the website. This is the initial report, and I came to this so you could see that what you then to get to the report is actually just a PDF that's on Senator Toomey's website, because they haven't appointed yet, and it's taking a long time to load, because they don't have a chairperson yet. There isn't actually, frankly, a good explanation for it, because honestly, even if Senate Majority Leader McConnell didn't want to elevate this work, obviously Speaker Pelosi could give them a website for them to create. But anyway, they don't have it. But these are not super long reports. They're like 20 pages typically. They've done 2 so far. They're really interesting, specifically again about what's going on with the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve, and they're asking really good questions. So in the first report, they asked really good questions, and then I'm going to go to the second report. They then report back on the answers they received to their questions. So this is an example where it's on French Hill's website to get to the second report. So again, you have to go to a PDF. It's the world's worst situation for someone who's trying to search. You're not going to find it unless you know where to look. So as you'll see, so the second report came out June 18th, which means that this month's report is due soon. So that'll be something for you to be aware. If you become familiar with the issues that are being raised in the first 2 reports, you may have a ready-made interesting story to be reporting when this third report comes out soon, I guess in the next week or so. And you'll see they're only 22 pages long. So they're not these super dense things. They are really very, they are laden with the acronyms of this world, the Federal Reserve and Treasury world. And Bharat Ramamurthy happens to be someone who's very active on Twitter. So he's someone you can be following because he starts talking about what's going on Twitter. And I imagine he might be more accessible than some of the members of Congress, because I think he also works for a nonprofit, but he's the only person who's on it who's not an elected official. So that is an important universe that's not getting enough attention and needs a lot more, because while we're all talking about the PPP loans, there's over $1 trillion that are out there being spent. So there's a lot more money that's going out the door than just the PPP loans and the contracts. That was the first of the 3 oversight bodies that was created by the CARES Act. The second one was called the PRAC, which you may have been hearing. It is the Pandemic Relief Accountability Committee. That is a committee that was stood up of existing inspectors general. So they do have a website. So the thing that's important that I first wanted you to see are who is on this Pandemic Relief Accountability Committee. You'll see this is their website, pandemic.oversight.gov. It is currently being chaired by the head of all the inspectors general, Mike Horowitz, who is the Justice Department Inspector General. And just as a side note, the reason he's the chair is that the person who was appointed by Michael Horowitz to be the chair was Glenn Fine, who was at the time the acting Pentagon Inspector General. And you may remember hearing the news that shortly after that appointment, President Trump removed Glenn Fine from his position, which from my perspective was entirely gratuitous and only happened because he didn't want him to be running this particular operation. And it was in the midst of what was a decapitating of a number of inspectors general's offices. And it's sort of interesting as you see, as you look through the membership of who is on the PRAC, you'll see there's a couple of examples where they're acting inspectors general. And that is because in both, let's see, in the State Department and in the Department of Transportation, like this person, those were examples where the president removed the inspectors general and in both cases put political appointees in their place who are also maintaining their position in the agency. So they're both acting as an inspector general, which is supposed to be an independent watchdog, while at the same time being part of the management structure, which is anathema to the whole point of the IG system. The reason I'm pointing it out is not all IGs are equal, not all are as independent as others, and so it's important to sort of get to know who it is that you're interested in. For example, the Department of Agriculture, based on where your region or what you're covering, that may be a really important IG for you to be getting to know. Phyllis Fong, who is that, here she is. She's been in that position for a very long time and is not sort of new to the game. So she's someone you probably should want to reach out to if you happen to have an interest in what's going on with the farming, because there's a lot of money that's going specifically out to the farms, again, not getting a lot of attention. So in addition to the PRAC, which is the committee that was created by the law, where all of these IGs are members of it, but they continue to be having their responsibilities for the specific agencies that are also doling out a lot of funds. The PRAC has, and you'll see at the bottom, some staff. So Bob Westbrooks and Linda Miller are people that you probably want to reach out to directly if you want to be getting access to the big picture of what the PRAC collectively is doing. So I'll get back to it in a second, but they do have a website that they have stood up where their intent is to be collecting data from the different agencies. I have to tell you, I'm a little worried about the likelihood of their success. Part of the problem has been that OMB, which is an arm of the White House, the Office of Management and Budget, sent out a directive in April that told all of the agencies that they don't need to worry about collecting any more data from the recipients who are getting from the various agencies that are doling out these funds. They don't have to receive any additional information from the recipients beyond what they were already collecting in the past for usaspending.gov, which is the database for all government spending. And that directive essentially meant that the agencies were not doing what the law required, which was to get quarterly data from the recipients of the funds on how they've spent their money. So the PRAC was waiting for all the agencies to be collecting all this data that at the moment, none of them are, except, interestingly, the Department of Treasury Inspector General. So they're getting like my gold star right now. So I just want to point out where they are. That's the only Inspector General. And usually you wouldn't expect it's the IG who's doing it. And I'm going too fast. This guy has created a website that that will be filled with data that they are requesting of all the recipients that Treasury is sending out funds to. So at least that is one place where you'll be able to get data on things that data from the recipients, which at the moment no one else is requesting. None of the other agencies are requesting.
The Treasury website, you say they're going to be collecting and releasing data on all the programs or on specific programs?
No, just all the money that's being released by Treasury.
Okay. And somebody's asking, do you know when that data will be released?
I don't know the answer to that, but they've just sent out the notice to the recipients to receive the data.
Okay.
So, so that's something to watch for. And I frankly think that begs the question why the other IGs aren't doing that, or why the PRAC as an entity isn't doing that as well. We've been in communication with them, with the leadership of the PRAC, about the real harm that was done by this OMB April guidance. And we've in fact had Congress asking questions of OMB, and they're sort of now acknowledging that maybe that was not exactly accurate, but now months are passing and businesses are closing. And, you know, my worry is we may find out in 6 months or a year that many of the recipients did not put their funds towards keeping people employed. And it's going to be too late by the time we find that out. The intent of the Congress was 3 months after the funds were released, we were supposed to be getting that data in, and we're not going to be. So just going back to what the PRAC has set up is their intent is to be following all these different funds. So you'll see here, it is not just the money going to small businesses and states and local and tribal governments and farms, but also the special bailouts for the airline industry and for hospitals. So that's their intent, and they're not there yet. They don't have the data yet. So that's part of why my organization, POGO, has decided that we're going to be launching in the next 2 weeks. We've been able to track about 1.2 trillion in these funds, and our goal, so our website is pogo.org, and we'll have a big splash page on it when we launch. But our goal is going to be over the next couple of months, in the next couple of weeks, we'll have essentially access to more data on spending than anyone else, any of the other microsites that have focused and done a terrific job. And we have a handout, which was a real actual oversight that we didn't include ProPublica, because they've done a great job on the contract. So that's one that I'm glad you're going to be talking to them after me. But we're going to be over time trying to overlay some really important, sort of what Chris was talking about before, socioeconomic indicators as well as corporate accountability indicators, unemployment data, as well as demographics based on census data for, actually, we do think it's journalistically interesting on which communities were getting more funds. Were they those that needed it most, or those that had either political relationships or just had easier access to banks? So these are things that we think are going to be really important to be looking at. So that was the second entity that was created by the CARES Act. The first was that commission. The second is the PRAC. The third was a Special Inspector General for pandemic relief. I didn't bother noting that he was one of the members of the PRAC. That was part of the law, but he doesn't have a website yet. So his name is Bryan Miller. And as Chris may have talked about, have you talked much about sort of the coverage of the TARP and how there was at that time a Special Inspector General who was very active?
We had a journalist, Jim Steele, yesterday who kind of talked about a story he did about it, but he didn't really talk much about the IG, the special IG.
So some of what happened, and we were involved with the writing of the drafting of some of these oversight mechanisms. The theory was these were successful operations under the TARP. We learned some lessons on how to make them stronger. So we created this committee of IGs, which also existed in the time of the TARP, and there was a Special Inspector General who was very active. His name was Neil Borofsky. Also, those are useful people if you want to be doing coverage of what kinds of oversight should happen. A couple of names of people who were doing it back then. So Neil Borofsky, B-A-R-O-F-S-K-Y, is in New York. And Earl Devaney, who ran this committee of IGs during that time, is in Florida. They have great insights into what they were doing at the time and how they were accessing and uncovering fraud and misconduct. But anyway, the point is the person who now has been identified to be the Inspector General's name is Bryan Miller. I knew him when he was previously, during the Bush administration even, an Inspector General for the GSA. But he's very controversial because for the last year, or maybe 2 years, he was actually in the White House counsel's office protecting the president during the impeachment hearings. So there's a real question about whether Bryan is going to be able to rise to the occasion, having just come from that very not independent role to suddenly become a real independent overseer of all of this spending. So that's a wait and see, but he Unfortunately, the law, when they created his office, they did not create him with special hiring authorities. So he doesn't have a website yet. There's some stuff that's not his fault that's going to hinder them. So that was the third oversight mechanism that was created by the CARES Act. And his job is is also to be looking more directly around what the Treasury and the Federal Reserve are doing as an Inspector General, meaning he has more law enforcement authority, and the Congressional Committee, of course, doesn't have any law enforcement powers at all. Okay, so those are the government entities that were created specifically to cover COVID. But then I wanted to talk to you a little bit about some of the additional databases that are out there. So these are less about people who are sources, but more data sources. So let me do this.
Danielle, may I ask a question?
Oh yeah.
So you mentioned that the OMB guidance to PRAC says that they don't need to collect data from the recipients. So what are they doing?
So what they're doing is the data. So that's what's so interesting about some of the data that everyone has been reporting that was released by the SBA and Treasury, right? All the PPP loans. And you see this jobs data attached to it. I've been encouraging the committees to have a hearing on what exactly does that mean, because they haven't been collecting data since the people received the money. So there's only three options as far as I can see. Either it's just bad data, because you'll see that there's been a lot of reporting that many of the entities reported zero employees. So then the question is, why did the banks approve the loans? Or it is based on, even when there are numbers, it seems as though it's just based on what the people put in their application when they applied for the loan, on this is how many employees I have. So I think one of the underreported stories that I think really needs to be looked at also is, go to these people and say, it says here you have 300 employees. Have they been furloughed? And that's the kind of thing that I think, if you can, in your communities, look at some of these. If you hear about furloughs, go back and look. Did those entities get a PPP loan? Because that's one of the conditions, right? Is that they keep them for a number of weeks. There's a question whether that's going to be extended or not, but I think that's a super important question. So the bottom line to what we can tell, to answer your question, is it appears that what they're reporting is simply what the SBA received in the loan applications. So some of the websites that I was mentioning, so ours is the one that's not there yet, but we have been, and this is something that I would encourage all of you to do as well. We have a whistleblower tip line, and of course, because my organization was actually created by whistleblowers, Pentagon whistleblowers, in 1981. So that's always been a big part of who we are, is talking to people who are inside the system, who are revealing wrongdoing. That's of course an important element for your journalistic activities as well. So having tip lines is a very good way of learning about things that you wouldn't know otherwise. So POGO did an investigation that we came out with, I think about 2 weeks ago, because we had a number of dental hygienists who came to us through our tip line. That's not a community of people that we normally talk to, but they reached out to us because they were alarmed that they were being asked to go back to work, they thought, prematurely. And we were able to, because of those tips, learn that actually lobbyists for the American Dental Association aggressively lobbied the CDC to lower their standards for what dentists were required to meet, and because the dentists aren't making money if they're closed. And so they were able to open. So all of you probably have been getting calls from your dentist saying, do you want to come back and have your cleaning? And you're like, are you sure I really need to be cleaned back yet? Well, the hygienists were very concerned about it. So that's, but that's the kind of thing we learned through our tip line. So I really encourage, whether you're a print or broadcast, having some web presence so people know that they can reach out to you with something that they want to talk about that's happening in their world. Because this affects every part of our society right now. So it's not sort of a really siloed world of whistleblowers or sources. So the Committee for Responsible Budgets Money Tracker is very, very helpful in focusing on how this money is, where it's coming from in the first place. They are an organization that is very focused on sort of balanced budgets, and they're less focused on where the money's going and more on is it coming from the Federal Reserve versus loans versus grants versus contracts. And so they also have some very good YouTube tutorials that help to sort of explain some of this stuff, because I'm not particularly literate in covering finance, and they're very good at explaining that. So and they also have a very interesting board of former heads of OMB, and there are a lot of sort of heads of agencies and former senators and members of Congress are on their board. So they're more at the front end of where the money's coming from and less on who it's going to. I gave to Chris this database, which also has, this list, which also has links to the usaspending.gov and the other big federal agency databases. And I think, those are sort of obvious what they are. And I think you're going to be driving down more. So I should actually do more stopping and listening.
Yeah, and we will be or already have posted on our website those two resources that Danielle was talking about, that article on resources that Pogo did a few weeks ago or months ago, and the handout that you just saw up on the screen. That'll be on our website here real soon today.
So I see a question. Small employers were not required to submit Social Security numbers of the employees they pledged not to fire. Any tips on how reporters can track people who are laid off without this? Oh, well, again, this is one of the things. Let people know you want to hear from them is one thing, because people are upset, right? And so I think letting people know you want to hear from them is probably the best one, because I don't know. They were not asked. Not only were they not asked to submit Social Security numbers, they weren't asked names or anything. It was just numbers of employees. And arguably, they weren't required to keep the same employees. So for example, if they were a restaurant that already furloughed their workers, they weren't required to bring back the same people. It's just the same number of people. So I actually would ask that of any of you, if you've covered any of this, if you have any tips also, because that's really good sort of gumshoe reporting.
Yeah. We have a question from Michelle. I want to get to that in a second, but I just want to ask you about back in 2000. I guess with the stimulus bill in 2009, the American Recovery AARA. Yep. Can't remember what the name of it is, but they had this metric of jobs supported or job saved or supported or something like that.
Yeah.
In general, is there an assessment about whether those numbers were actually real or if they were BS?
It's funny. I know that you're going to have our friends at Good Jobs First, which is another one of the websites that I mentioned. You're going to be having them, maybe they've already spoken or they're going to be talking to you. They question those numbers. They think that there were, actually, interestingly, their perspective is that there were some business owners who were hostile to Obama and who denied that jobs were saved or created. I don't know enough to know whether that's right, but they were looking at the data and they have reasons. So that's a good question to ask. I think, is it Phil Matera who's going to be speaking to your?
Yeah, he spoke. He explained their database a couple days ago. He was here on Monday.
Okay. That was one of the questions they had. So that will be one of the things that I think we now have the benefit of experience, that when this data starts to come out on jobs, I think it's all going to be about journalists talking to employees or labor unions, or I think labor unions also are a really great resource for this kind of question, especially for those kinds of employees that are unionized. Talking to those locals would be a really helpful angle, because they're going to know what's going on.
Okay. So a couple of questions in chat. Do you want me to read them, or can you see them in there?
I can see them. Okay. Can I tell us what our new database will include when we release it? Yes. So it's, I've just been told by my team that it's going to have like 1.2 trillion in spending. At least we're going to be able to show where it's going. We're not down to the zip code yet, but our intent is that we'll be able to get down to the zip code. And then our goal is to start overlaying additional data sets, which will, our first one that we think is most employment is unemployment. So that's another way of doing this analysis, right? Is looking at the state unemployment agencies and what their numbers are showing, and having the overlay of what's going on with where the money's going to see if there's a proper fit. We're also going to be doing an overlay of COVID cases because we think that's also an important and relevant factor. We will be including the Good Jobs First data sometime this fall, which is going to help with a lot of the major employers' accountability data in terms of when they violated labor rules and regulations and environmental laws. But our intent ultimately is to have a much better interface. So as you may see, a lot of these websites are really kind of just Excel spreadsheets, which are very hard to visualize. And our intent is for it to be much more map oriented, so you can get a better sense physically of where the money is going. So those are the kinds of things I can speak to, but honestly, the team that's working on it would be much more articulate on everything else that we'll be adding over the next few months. Okay, so the PPP loans were supposed to go to companies that had no more than 500 employees. Yes, so actually, and it wasn't just the PPP loans, also the Federal Reserve benefits. There was lobbying that took place to remove conditions for a lot of these loans, which is outrageous and totally counter to what the Congress was intending. So for example, you'll find with the Federal Reserve, they had a facility that was called the Main Street facility, which was for, obviously supposed to be for some of the smaller businesses, but they actually removed that employment, that lower threshold for employment to something like 10,000, and suddenly oil and gas industry was qualified for those loans, which were very clearly not intended for these, massive international conglomerates. So that's something that is underreported, and there has been some writing again by that two people who are very articulate on that. One is that Bharat Ramamurthy, who I mentioned, who's on the Oversight Commission, and Sarah Bloom Raskin, the woman who had been on the Federal Reserve before. She wrote a op-ed, I think in the New York Times or the Washington Post, raising exactly that point, that these industries are lobbying to change some of the restrictions on these loans or access to funds so that the bigger, more politically connected institutions are getting them. So is there data on the 600 employment benefit? Yes, we're going to be including that. Also, the direct payments is going to be part of what we're going to have in our database. I don't think any of the other databases have that yet, and we're going to have that. That's an easier one to get down to the zip code. It does not, as far as I know, factor into PPP. I think those are two separate programs, and I don't think there's any particular relationship. Okay.
Danielle, if I could ask a follow-up on that.
Yeah.
The unemployment benefit data, is that all gathered at the state level, or is it rolled up to the federal level?
It is mostly state is going to be the better data. That's what we're going to be pulling from. So that's what we're doing. Treasury was the originator of those. So those are, Julie is asking the question about the stimulus checks to every American. Those were those $1,200 checks that that some people got, which is different from the $600 unemployment benefit that people are getting weekly. So all of these, we're trying to capture all of this, and we're not trying to get the names of the individual people who are receiving those funds, but we are looking at that for demographics in terms of communities to see, to make sure that it's getting to the people who are losing their jobs. Okay, on Treasury loans to large companies, is there a database of these loans yet? We are hoping to have that in our database. Treasury has been giving some information out that's being collected, and I do think ProPublica may have some of that in their database, but you should ask him if he's going to be talking to you next. But there isn't enough yet. So they have not been as transparent as they need to be. We are pulling some, because I'm very lucky, one of the people on my staff helped to create the database that usaspending.gov was based on. So we have great capacity to sort of pull data that the government doesn't even realize that it has. So that's why I think we're able to track 1.2 trillion, and no one else has been able to do that yet. And I'm hoping that much of that's going to be there. But unfortunately, a lot of that is also not necessarily going to companies. Treasury doesn't give to companies as much as they're giving, and the Federal Reserve, to industries. And the thing that's also really complicated, but is really worth pursuing, is they're also giving to entities like BlackRock, and then BlackRock's giving them out. So there's also a sort of a transparency wall between what the government does to BlackRock and then who gets it in response to that. Actually, POGO also just came out with an investigation today where we found that there was hundreds, at least dozens, not hundreds, of private equity firms that have benefited through these PPP loans, which is clearly not the intent of the Congress. So that's on our homepage on pogo.org as well. So all of you are on the right track, that there's all kinds of, maybe not illegal, but clearly counter to the intent of the Congress, and certainly worthy of reporting, because I think the Congress is starting to say, wait, that is absolutely not what we intended. We did not want private equity firms to suddenly be benefiting. You know, they have access to billions of dollars, and it was clear that the intent was for these loans to be going to people who didn't have access to that kind of capital. So anyone have good tracking on states? Yes, so on the web, on the, okay, we have a couple of minutes left. On that Word document that you have, there were a couple that were specific to states. So I'll quickly go back to the Rockefeller Institute has a COVID state relief dashboard, and there's a subscription service that if you work for one of the wealthier institutions, they may have a subscription, but you can still access some information in the federal funds information for states. And that is also state-based information. So for example, this one, it doesn't go into great detail, but it gives you some comparative numbers. And then you can get a sense per capita, whether it's PPP program and other things. So that may be useful to answer your question.